Detroit, 1975. A man worth more than $70 million is sitting in the back of a car outside a restaurant, and he cannot go home. Not because he doesn't have a home, he has several. A place in Grosse Pointe, an apartment in Manhattan, a villa on the Riviera his second wife picked out herself, with her name on the deed and her taste in every room. He can't go home because going home means facing a woman who married him for love, who spent 11 years turning herself into the perfect corporate wife, and who is about to find out, from a newspaper, like everyone else, that her husband has been seeing another woman for months. His name is Henry Ford II. Everyone in Detroit calls him the Juice, and not always with affection. He runs the company his grandfather built and his father inherited and died running. He fired Lee Iacocca, one of the most respected executives in American business, with a single sentence: "I just don't like you." No warning, no explanation demanded. That was the whole justification, and it was enough, because at Ford, what Henry said was final. But there's one place where being the boss doesn't work, and by 1975, Henry Ford II is about to lose there for the second time. This isn't really a story about cars. It's about a man who converted religions for one wife, humiliated another in the tabloids, and by the time he was done, had spent more on divorce settlements than most people will earn in 10 lifetimes. Along the way, his personal life got so loud that it started drowning out the business headlines. At a company that was still called Ford Motor and still bore his family's name on every dashboard in America. 3 marriages, 3 very different kinds of collapse, and a family fortune that survived all of it, though not without scars that showed up decades later in boardrooms, in wills, and in a name, Ford, that started meaning something different to the people who read Vogue instead of the stock pages. We're going to start at the wedding that made him a Catholic, then we'll get to the affair that made him a punchline, and we'll end with the 3rd marriage nobody saw coming, the one that finally outlasted him. Stick with me here, because the parts that get skipped in the 2-minute versions of this story, the annulment fight, the $16 million number, the woman his own family didn't want him to marry a 3rd time, are the parts that actually explain what almost broke this family apart. Understand what Henry Ford II actually was to Detroit in 1975. He wasn't just rich. He was the last man alive who carried the name of the company in his own name, grandson of the founder, son of the man who died running it, and the person who had personally pulled Ford Motor back from the brink after the Second World War, when the whole operation was losing close to $10 million a month. Presidents called him for advice on the auto industry. He sat on museum boards, university boards, foundation boards. He had, by any conventional measure, already won. And none of it mattered the moment his second marriage started coming apart in public. Because the story that gets told about Henry Ford II, in most places, stops at the business. Robert McNamara, Lee Iacocca, the Mustang, the Pinto, the boardroom purges. What gets left out is that this was also a man who converted an entire religion to marry one woman, humiliated her badly enough that she needed a special act of a foreign parliament just to get free of an earlier marriage before she ever met him, and then went on to repeat almost the exact same betrayal twice more, each time louder than the last, each time more expensive. If you've watched a few of these old money downfall stories before, you already know how they tend to go. Somebody inherits everything, somebody falls for the wrong person, and the money outlives the marriage. Henry Ford II's story follows that shape, mostly, but there's a twist buried in the middle of it that even a lot of Ford historians gloss over, and I promise you it's coming. Before we get into it, if stories like this are your thing, old money, bad marriages, empires under pressure, hit subscribe now, because we cover a new one of these almost every week, and you don't want to miss where this channel goes next. Okay, let's go back to 1936, on a boat. Act 1, the wedding of the century. Henry Ford II met Anne McDonnell on an ocean liner coming back from Europe in the summer of 1936. He was 19, heading into Yale, loud and likable in the way rich boys who've never been told no tend to be. She was 17, from Southampton, granddaughter of a utilities tycoon named Thomas Murray, raised at the Convent of the Sacred Heart, one of the oldest private girls' schools in the country. Her father, James Francis McDonnell, was a Wall Street financier whose own father had come to New York as an Irish famine refugee and built a fortune from nothing. Her family was Catholic, old money, serious about their faith in a way the Fords, who were Methodist, simply were not. Henry wanted to marry her. Her family made the terms clear. If he wanted Anne, he'd convert. So he did. He took instruction from a young Monsignor named Fulton Sheen, who would later become one of the most famous Catholic broadcasters in American history, and on July 12, 1940, Henry Ford II was received into the Catholic Church. The next day, Sheen married them at the Church of the Sacred Heart of Jesus on Long Island. Years afterward, Sheen would say his inspiration for taking on the young Ford as a student was, plainly, Anne McDonnell herself. His grandfather, the Henry Ford, the one whose name was on every factory gate in Michigan, was furious enough about the conversion that he reportedly considered cutting his grandson out of the family inheritance entirely. Letters poured in from strangers telling the young heir what a mistake he was making. None of it stopped the wedding. By the reception, the old man was dancing with the bride, and whatever objections he'd had seemed to evaporate for the night. The wedding itself was enormous, one of those events the papers called the last great society wedding before the war swallowed everything. Two of America's wealthiest Irish Catholic families joined in a Long Island church, with more reporters outside than guests inside. Stephen Birmingham, chronicling New York's old Irish families years later, called it as close to the last truly great wedding of its kind, before the world changed for good. For a while, it looked like exactly the story everyone wanted. Henry went off to the Navy during the war. His father Edsel died of cancer in 1943, and at 25, with his grandfather too old and too erratic to keep running things, Henry took control of a company that was hemorrhaging nearly $10 million a month. He fired his grandfather's old cronies, brought in a new generation of managers pulled from Washington and the auto industry's rival firms, and by the late 1940s, had the company back from the edge of collapse. At home, though, something was drifting. Anne was reserved, precise, formal, the kind of woman society writers described as having a cool, tight-lipped dignity. Henry was the opposite, loud at parties, constantly performing warmth in rooms full of strangers, huggy and extroverted in a way that read as charm to outsiders, and, increasingly, as exhausting to his own wife. Over 20 years and 3 children, that gap didn't close, it widened. Those early years at the company were brutal in ways that rarely make it into the highlight reel. Henry hadn't even finished his degree at Yale, having reportedly handed in a ghost-written term paper before leaving school entirely. And here he was at 28, expected to run an operation employing over 100,000 people with almost no formal training for the job. He leaned hard on outside talent to survive those first years, bringing in a group of former military statisticians who'd later be nicknamed the Whiz Kids, among them a young Robert McNamara, who would go on to become Ford's president and, later, U.S. Secretary of Defense. It worked. By 1956, the company was strong enough to go public, ending 80 years of complete family ownership and turning Henry Ford II into the chairman of one of the largest publicly traded corporations on Earth. Success at the company, though, didn't translate to warmth at home. By the late 1950s, Henry Ford II was one of the most recognizable businessmen in the country, chairman of a company that had just gone public, sitting on the boards of some of the most prestigious institutions in America. And he was also, by most accounts, a man who had stopped being faithful to his wife, long before anyone outside Detroit noticed. Then, in 1960, at a party at Maxim's in Paris, he met the woman who would end the marriage entirely. Act 2. The Italian Divorcee. Her name was Maria Cristina Vettore. Everyone called her Cristina. Born in a small town near Vicenza, in northern Italy, she'd lost her father as a child, studied art at the Accademia di Belle Arti in Milan, married and divorced a British Royal Navy officer named Robin Austin through an act of the Canadian Parliament, since provincial law in Quebec didn't allow ordinary divorce proceedings at the time, and reinvented herself in Paris as exactly the kind of glamorous, worldly, independent woman Henry Ford had never been allowed to have at home. The affair didn't stay quiet for long. By the early 60s, gossip columns on both sides of the Atlantic were tracking Henry Ford II's trips to Europe and connecting the dots. When the separation from Anne finally became public, Time magazine described society watchers across the country trying to piece together how a marriage that had looked like something out of a woman's magazine ended up heading toward a European divorcee. Because Anne was Catholic and, on paper, so was Henry, this wasn't a straightforward divorce. It took until 1964 for the marriage to formally end, 24 years after that wedding on Long Island, and it took a very public, very messy separation before that, one that had reporters camped outside both households trying to get a comment from either side. Anne kept the Long Island estate, a 235-acre property Henry had built at enormous cost. She remarried a few years later to a Los Angeles attorney named Dean Johnson, moved with him to New York in 1980, and by most accounts built a quieter, calmer second act than the one she'd had as Mrs. Henry Ford II. What made the McDonnell divorce sting so much in the press wasn't just the affair itself. Affairs among wealthy industrialists were, unfortunately, not exactly rare in that era. It was the contrast. Anne had converted an entire wing of her identity around this marriage, in the sense that it defined her public role for over 2 decades, from the girl at the Convent of the Sacred Heart to the Woman's Society magazines held up as the picture of quiet, dignified American wealth. Watching that unravel over a European socialite half the country had never heard of before the scandal broke gave the story a kind of tabloid gravity that outlasted the actual news cycle by years. Society columnists kept referencing the McDonnell-Ford divorce well into the 1970s, using it as shorthand any time another prominent marriage started showing cracks. Henry didn't wait long. On February 19, 1965, barely a year after the divorce was finalized, he married Cristina in a private civil ceremony. She was 35, he was 47, and almost overnight, she became one of the most photographed women in American high society. Life magazine called her a highly effective ambassador for the Ford Motor Company. Women's Wear Daily gave her a nickname that stuck for a decade, the Complete Italian. By 1973, she'd been inducted into the International Best Dressed List's Hall of Fame, an honor reserved for the small handful of women considered permanently, undeniably stylish, rather than merely fashionable for a season. For a while, this marriage looked like the one that would actually work. Cristina traveled with Henry constantly, showed up at Le Mans for the 24-hour race he'd poured company money into winning, hosted parties for Ford executives and European royalty in the same room, and somehow made all of it look effortless. She became close friends with Imelda Marcos, the wife of the Philippine president, close enough that during an official state visit to Iran in 1971, marking 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy, the two women shared Mrs. Marcos's private royal encampment, rather than have Cristina stay at a hotel across the city. Vogue ran a feature on her under the headline, "Blonde and Lively." Detroit had never quite seen a Ford wife like this one. She was, by every outward measure, exactly the kind of wife a man in Henry Ford's position was supposed to have. Elegant, independent, photogenic, loyal, in public at least, and by all appearances devoted to a husband who, according to people close to the family, had grown convinced at one point that Cristina and Imelda Marcos were more than friends, an accusation Cristina denied outright, and one that seemed to say more about Henry's own suspicions than about anything Cristina had actually done. But underneath the parties and the magazine covers, the same pattern that had ended his first marriage was already starting again. Act 3. The Second Unraveling. By the mid-1970s, Henry Ford II was in his late 50s, and the company around him was going through its own kind of turmoil. Ford Motor Company was navigating some of the toughest years in its history: oil shocks, a shifting auto market, and a wave of scrutiny that would eventually engulf the Pinto and its fuel tank design. In 1978, Henry would fire Lee Iacocca, the man widely credited with the Mustang's success, and one of the most talented executives in the entire auto industry, in a boardroom conversation that lasted minutes and offered no real justification beyond 4 blunt words: "I just don't like you." It became one of the most talked-about corporate firings of the decade, a demonstration of exactly how much unchecked power one family name still carried at a publicly traded company with hundreds of thousands of shareholders who had no say in the matter at all. At home, that same instinct, that the rules other people lived by simply didn't apply to him, was playing out again, on a slower fuse. In 1975, while still married to Cristina, Henry Ford II began seeing a former model named Kathleen DuRoss. She was younger, twice divorced, raising 2 young children largely on her own, working in Detroit real estate and modeling when Henry met her. Unlike Cristina, DuRoss had no interest in the society circuit, no ambitions toward magazine profiles or best-dressed lists. People who knew her later described her as grounded in a way almost nobody else in Henry's orbit had been. The affair became an open secret in Detroit society circles well before it became public knowledge, the same slow leak that had doomed his first marriage all over again. Whispered about at the same dinner parties Cristina was still hosting, as the picture-perfect Mrs. Ford. Cristina, by most accounts, found out largely the way the public eventually did, through rumor that hardened into certainty faster than she could control. And unlike the quiet, drawn-out unraveling of the McDonnell marriage, which had stretched across years of separation before the paperwork caught up, this one moved fast and got ugly in a hurry. There were no children to consider this time, no religious conversion binding the two of them together, and no pretense left worth maintaining once the affair was confirmed. What had been 11 years of one of society's most photographed marriages became, almost overnight, a fight over money. A lot of money. People who worked at Ford headquarters during those years later described a chairman who seemed to run his company and his marriage by roughly the same instinct, deciding what he wanted and moving toward it, regardless of who got hurt along the way. The same year, the Iacocca situation was building toward its breaking point inside the company. The DuRoss relationship was building toward its own breaking point at home. 2 slow-burning fires, both eventually made public in the space of a few years, both driven by a man who had spent 4 decades being told, in one way or another, that he didn't need anyone's permission. Before we get into exactly how much this divorce cost, and what it did to the Ford family's reputation, right as the company was already under fire over safety scandals in the press, if you want to see how this compares to other old-money marriages that ended in very public, very expensive collapse, go check out the link in the description, or just stick around, because this channel does one of these every single week. Act 4. The Price of the Second Marriage. The Ford divorce, as some papers dryly called it, was formally filed under Michigan's no-fault divorce law and finalized in 1980. Both sides worked hard to avoid a public trial, and given how much either side stood to lose in open court, that avoidance made sense. 2 full days of intensive private negotiation ended with what one Wire report called an amicable settlement, reached quietly enough that neither attorney would confirm the terms at the time. Cristina's lawyer, A. Robert Zeff, would only say the settlement had been reached amicably. Henry's attorney, Milton Miller, called it fair for both sides and said his client was pleased he could end the marriage quietly. The terms came out eventually anyway, because with money like this, they always do. Cristina received a settlement reported at $16 million, an enormous sum in 1976 dollars, worth well over $80 million today when adjusted for inflation. And even that wasn't the end of it. In 1988, more than a decade after the divorce, Cristina sued Henry Ford II's estate again, seeking an additional $5 million in expanded alimony, a fight that dragged the whole saga back into headlines years after most people assumed it was settled for good, and one that continued even after Henry himself had died. Consider the timing. The Pinto fuel tank controversy was building through the mid to late 1970s into one of the most damaging product liability stories in American corporate history, eventually leading to lawsuits, a criminal case in Indiana, and congressional scrutiny of how the company had weighed the cost of a safety fix against the cost of settling wrongful death claims. Reporters covering that story were, in many cases, the same reporters covering Henry Ford II's personal life, working the same city, the same sources, sometimes the same afternoon edition. A board that was already fielding hard questions about crash safety did not need its chairman's name attached to a second scandal about a multi-million-dollar affair settlement running in the adjacent column. For a company that had spent the second half of the 1970s already fighting off some of the worst press in its history, over fuel tank safety, over recalls, over congressional hearings that put Ford executives under oath, the last thing the board wanted was its own chairman's divorce settlements playing out in the same newspapers covering all of that. Henry Ford II wasn't just a wealthy man having a messy personal year. He was the public face of a corporation whose stock, dealer network, and workforce all depended on some baseline of confidence in the man at the top. Every headline about a multi-million-dollar settlement, every photograph of Cristina outside a lawyer's office, chipped a little more at an image the company could not afford to keep losing, at the exact moment it needed the public on its side. It's worth sitting with how strange this actually was. Here was a man who ran one of the largest industrial employers in the country, who fired one of his most talented executives with 4 words and no appeal process, and who could not, in his own home, manage to keep a single marriage from ending in a very public, very expensive fight, twice. The control that worked on the executive floor of the Ford headquarters in Dearborn did not translate 1 inch into his personal life. If anything, the same bluntness that made him effective as a chairman made him almost incapable of managing a marriage with any subtlety at all. By the time the ink dried on the settlement, Henry Ford II was 62 years old, on his second failed marriage, and already deep into the relationship that would become his third and final one. Act 5, the marriage that lasted. He was 63, she was in her early 40s, and this time something was different. Kathy DuRoss wasn't a socialite, wasn't European royalty by association, wasn't the subject of magazine profiles calling her an ambassador for anything. She'd raised 2 kids largely on her own before meeting Henry, worked ordinary jobs in Detroit rather than moving through royal encampments and best-dressed lists, and by most accounts, she brought something into his life that neither of his first 2 marriages had managed, an actual home life, away from cameras, that he genuinely seemed to want to protect rather than perform for an audience. There was no annulment drama this time, no religious conversion required, no palace intrigue with foreign first ladies. Just, finally, a marriage that stayed out of the papers because there was nothing scandalous left to report. The marriage lasted the rest of his life. Henry Ford II died on September 29, 1987, at 70 years old, following years of declining health. He'd stepped back from day-to-day control of the company gradually through the late 70s and early 80s, giving up the chairmanship in 1980, the same year he remarried, as if some part of him understood that this third attempt needed room the company itself had never allowed his first 2 marriages to have. His funeral was held not in the Catholic church he'd converted into for Anne McDonnell decades earlier, but in an Episcopal church in Grosse Pointe. He'd reportedly left specific instructions for how he wanted the service handled, right down to insisting there be music and warmth rather than solemnity, saying he didn't want to be remembered only in a solemn fashion. It's a small, telling detail from a man who spent most of his life being described as difficult, autocratic, and nearly impossible to soften, right up to the instructions he left for his own goodbye. What he left behind wasn't just a fortune. It was a pattern the Ford family would keep confronting for generations afterward. Enormous wealth, enormous public scrutiny, and personal lives that kept buckling under both. His only son, Edsel Ford II, went on to serve more than 3 decades on the company's board before stepping back himself. His brother, William Clay Ford Sr., took over ownership of the Detroit Lions, a role that passed down through the family to his widow and eventually to his daughter, Sheila Ford Hamp, who still owns the team today. The Ford name stayed on the buildings, the dealerships, the stadiums. The company itself never came close to actual financial collapse because of any of this, but nearly broke the empire was never really about the balance sheet. It was about what almost happened to the family's name and to the public's patience with it. Every time another settlement number leaked, every time another wife's attorney talked to a reporter, every time the man running one of America's biggest companies made the front page for exactly the wrong reason instead of the right one. Ford Motor Company survived Henry Ford II's marriages completely intact. His reputation barely did, and by the time he died, his name carried as much tabloid weight from 3 marriages and 2 ugly divorces as it did industrial weight from the cars themselves. Closing/final CTA. 3 marriages, 2 very public divorces, 1 quiet one that actually held, and a family fortune that outlasted every single headline, mostly because the company itself was bigger than any one man's personal life. Even a man who acted, for most of his adult years, like the rules simply didn't apply to him. What makes this story stick, at least for me, isn't the dollar figures, even though $80 million in today's money for a single settlement is a staggering number by any measure. It's the repetition. 3 times, Henry Ford II found a woman, pursued her completely, upended his entire life to be with her, and then, twice, did the exact same thing to her that had brought them together in the first place. The man who could end a top executive's career in 1 sentence never once figured out how to end a relationship with any of that same decisiveness. He just let each one collapse in public, generally on a newspaper's timeline rather than his own. And maybe that's the real lesson buried under all the settlement numbers and society photographs. Running an empire and running a life are not the same skill, and some of the most powerful men in American history never once figured out how to tell the difference. If this is the kind of story you come here for, old money, bad marriages, families under pressure they couldn't fully survive without leaving a mark, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because we're covering another one of these next week, and based on the comments last time, you're going to want to see it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.